the ICLO members who will be having the function of readers during this seminar. As you know, we will meet 8 times. Each time we will read one of the sections of Freud's seminal paper, Civilization and Its Discontents. And after that, we will have a commentary, which of course is not going to be a line-by-line commentary of the text, but some aspect, some sentence, some idea chosen by our guest commentators, where they will put the magnifier to explore and hopefully discuss with you the effects of this reading. You may or you may not know that the reading that Lacan did of Freud transformed psychoanalysis in quite a radical way. And this initiative inscribes itself along the lines of the teaching of Jacques Lacan and his return to Freud. I will make a couple of very brief introductory remarks, and then we will move on to the reading. The first thing that struck me was in Strachey's forward to this paper, that he tells us that Freud had first chosen the title Das Unglück in der Kultur. The proposed translation of that is unhappiness in civilization. Freud also suggested for the English man's discomfort in civilization. And it's true that the English translation that was finally adopted makes the emphasis be on civilization rather than on man, and on the subjective experience of the subject in culture, in society. I think the word Unglück, which I may be pronouncing wrongly, is a fantastic word for a Lacanian. It can be translated rather than as unhappiness, as misfortune, as mishap, accident, bad luck. This, of course, for us resonates a lot with Lacan's developments on the idea of contingency, of encounter, of chance, and how do we, as speaking beings, respond to the encounter, to the unexpected, to the bad luck, to what erupts in ways that do not enter the program of how we have constructed our relationship to the world and to others. I think this is one of the main reasons why we decided to create this platform, this initiative, in the face of something that is of this order, of the order of the bad encounter. I was trying to look for the Greek word for this, and I couldn't find it. But it's something that definitely Lacan dedicated a lot of thinking and a lot of writing to. Would we be here if it weren't for the coronavirus, for this mishap, for this misfortune? We don't know, but probably not. So in the face of this, we welcome what we can do with what we encounter. And we welcome you all to share this response with us. So, what is psychoanalysis? It's a big question. There isn't one answer. There are many, probably as many as people posing the question itself. Let's pose the working hypothesis that, contrary to common understanding, psychoanalysis is not a talking cure. Psychoanalysis is rather a writing cure. And as a consequence of this, that the psychoanalyst doesn't listen. That's not his job. What the psychoanalyst does is reading. And this is why we propose, in the gap opened by this bad encounter with the real, a reading seminar. And after that, we will see what this produces. In other words, what letters it produces and how will those letters be read. For the moment, I can tell you there's participants at this very moment from more than 20 countries, probably, from Serbia to Japan, from Russia to Australia, from Spain to Germany, Lebanon, the United States, Canada, all corners of the world. I can see on my screen, thanks to this technology, that there's 104 people at the moment. We had over 150 registrations. And what caught my attention, as it happens in a completely subjective way, was where do the majority of the attendees come from? And it turns out that they come from, the majority in numbers come from 3 countries, from Israel, from Ireland, and from India. Today, we're going to read how Freud tries to conceptualize the ego, the self. We could say as well, the I. This instance so shaken by mishaps, so affected by luck, whether it's good or bad. The ego, the I, is never prepared for it. For me, this has given me already a little plus of humor, because perhaps you know, my mother tongue being Spanish, and of course my unconscious having been made of the elucubration of knowledge created with the phonemes and the sounds of this la langue, I was given this plus of comedy when I noticed that the initials of these 3 countries were ay, ay, ay. So let's begin. I hope you all have your copy. I'm sure many of you will have a lot to say about reading Freud in English, reading Freud in another language other than the one it was written. This is very important for us psychoanalysts. Many of you would have a lot to say about the various translations proposed and critical reading of Freud's translations have been done for decades now, and I'm sure we will all benefit from comments or remarks, clarifications, ideas, corrections that you may want to share with us. So it's page 64 in my edition of the Standard Edition, Civilization and Its Discontents. It is impossible to escape the impression that people commonly use false standards of measurement, that they seek power, success, and wealth for themselves, and admire them in others, and that they underestimate what is of true value in life. And yet, in making any general judgment of this sort, we are in danger of forgetting how variegated the human world and its mental life are. There are a few men from whom their contemporaries do not withhold admiration, although their greatness rests on attributes and achievements which are completely foreign to the aims and ideals of the multitude. One might easily be inclined to suppose that it is, after all, only a minority which appreciates these great men, while the large majority cares nothing for them. But things are probably not as simple as that, thanks to the discrepancies between people's thoughts and their actions, and to the diversity of their wishful impulses. One of these exceptional few calls himself my friend in his letters to me. I had sent him my small book that treats religion as an illusion, and he answered that he entirely agreed with my judgments upon religion, but that he was sorry I had not properly appreciated the true source of religious sentiments. This, he says, consists in a peculiar feeling which he himself is never without, which he finds confirmed by many others, and which he may suppose is present in millions of people. It is a feeling which he would like to call a sensation of eternity, a feeling as of something limitless, unbounded, as it were, oceanic. This feeling, he adds, is a purely subjective fact, not an article of faith. It brings with it no assurance of personal immortality, but it is the source of the religious energy which is seized upon by the various churches and religious systems, directed by them into particular channels, and doubtless also exhausted by them. One may, he thinks, rightly call oneself religious on the ground of this oceanic feeling alone, even if one rejects every belief and illusion illusion. The views expressed by the friend whom I so much honor, and who himself once praised the magic of illusion in a poem, caused me no small difficulty. I cannot discover this oceanic feeling in myself. It is not easy to deal scientifically with feelings. One can attempt to describe their physiological signs. Where this is not possible, and I am afraid that the oceanic feeling too will defy this kind of characterization, nothing remains but to fall back on the ideational content which is most readily associated with the feeling. If I have understood my friend rightly, he means the same thing by it as the consolation offered by an original and somewhat eccentric dramatist to his hero who is facing a self-inflicted death. we cannot fall out of this world. That is to say, it is a feeling of an indissoluble bond, of being one with the external world as a whole. I may remark that to me, this seems something rather in the nature of an intellectual perception, which is not, it is true, without an accompanying feeling tone, but only such as would be present with any other act of thought of equal range. From my own experience, I could not convince myself of the primary nature of such a feeling. But this gives me no right to deny that it does in fact occur in other people. The only question is whether it is being correctly interpreted and whether it ought to be regarded as the source and origin of the whole need for religion. I have nothing to suggest which could have a decisive influence on the solution of this problem. The idea of men's receiving an intimation of their connection with the world around them through an immediate feeling which is from the outset directed to that purpose sounds so strange and fits in so badly with the fabric of our psychology that one is justified in attempting to discover a psychoanalytic, that is, a genetic explanation of such a feeling. The following line of thought suggests itself. Normally, there is nothing of which we are more certain than the feeling of ourself, of our own ego. This ego appears to us as something autonomous and unitary, marked off distinctly from everything else. That such an appearance is deceptive, and that on the contrary, the ego is continued inwards without any sharp delimitation into an unconscious mental entity which we designate as the id, and for which it serves as a kind of facade. This was a discovery first made by psychoanalytic research, which should still have much more to tell us about the relation of the ego to the id. But towards the outside, at any rate, the ego seems to maintain clear and sharp lines of demarcation. There is only one state, admittedly an unusual state, but not one that can be stigmatized as pathological, in which it does not do this. At the height of being in love, the boundary between ego and object threatens to melt away. Against all the evidence of his senses, a man who is in love declares that I and you are one, and is prepared to behave as if it were a fact. What can be temporarily done away with by a physiological, i.e. normal function, must also, of course, be liable to be disturbed by pathological processes. Pathology has made us acquainted with a great number of states in which the boundary lines between the ego and the external world become uncertain, or in which they are actually drawn incorrectly. There are cases in which parts of a person's own body, even portions of his own mental life, his perceptions, thoughts, and feelings, appear alien to him and as not belonging to his ego. There are other cases in which he ascribes to the external world things that clearly originate in his own ego and that ought to be acknowledged by it. Thus, even the feeling of our own ego is subject to disturbances, and the boundaries of the ego are not constant. Further reflection tells us that the adult's ego feeling cannot have been the same from the beginning. It must have gone through a process of development which cannot, of course, be demonstrated, but which admits of being constructed with a fair degree of probability. An infant at the breast does not as yet distinguish his ego from the external world as the source of the sensations flowing in upon him. He gradually learns to do so in response to various promptings. He must be very strongly impressed by the fact that some sources of excitation, which he will later recognize as his own bodily organs, can provide him with sensations at any moment, whereas other sources evade him from time to time. Among them, what he desires most of all, his mother's breast, and only reappear as a result of his screaming for help. In this way, there is for the first time set over against the ego an object in the form of something which exists outside and which is only forced to appear by a special action. A further incentive to a disengagement of the ego from the general mass of sensations, that is, to the recognition of an outside, an external world, is provided by the frequent, manifold, and unavoidable sensations of pain and unpleasure, the removal and avoidance of which is enjoined by the pleasure principle in the exercise of its unrestricted domination. A tendency arises to separate from the ego everything that can become a source of such unpleasure, to throw it outside and to create a pure pleasure ego which is confronted by a strange and threatening outside. The boundaries of this primitive pleasure ego cannot escape rectification through experience. Some of the things that one is unwilling to give up, because they give pleasure, are nevertheless not ego, but object. And some sufferings that one seeks to expel turn out to be inseparable from the ego in virtue of their internal origin. One comes to learn a procedure by which, through a deliberate direction of one's sensory activities and through suitable muscular action, one can differentiate between what is internal, what belongs to the ego, and what is external, what emanates from the outer world. In this way, one makes the first step towards the introduction of the reality principle, which is to dominate future developments. This differentiation, of course, serves the practical purpose of enabling one to defend oneself against sensations of unpleasure, which one actually feels or with which one is threatened. In order to fend off certain unpleasurable excitations arising from within, the ego can use no other methods than those which it uses against unpleasure coming from without. And this is the starting point of important pathological disturbances. In this way, then, the ego detaches itself from the external world. Or, to put it more correctly, originally the ego includes everything. Later, it separates off an external world from itself. Our present ego feeling is, therefore, only a shrunken residue of a much more inclusive, indeed all-embracing feeling, which corresponded to a more intimate bond between the ego and the world about it. If we may assume that there are many people in whose mental life this primary ego feeling has persisted to a greater or less degree, it would exist in them side by side with the narrower and more sharply demarcated ego feeling of maturity, like a kind of counterpart to it. In that case, the ideational contents appropriate to it would be precisely those of limitlessness and of a bond with the universe, the same idea with which my friend elucidated the oceanic feeling. But have we a right to assume the survival of something that was originally there alongside of what was later derived from it? Undoubtedly, there is nothing strange in such a phenomenon, whether in the mental field or elsewhere. In the animal kingdom, we hold to the view that the most highly developed species have proceeded from the lowest, and yet we find all the simple forms still in existence today. The race of the great saurians is extinct and has made way for the mammals. But a true representative of it, the crocodile, still lives among us. This analogy may be too remote, and it is also weakened by the circumstance that the lower species which survive are, for the most part, not the true ancestors of the present day, more highly developed species. As a rule, the intermediate links have died out and are known to us only through reconstruction. In the realm of the mind, on the other hand, what is primitive is so commonly preserved alongside of the transformed version which has arisen from it that it is unnecessary to give instances as evidence. When this happens, it is usually in consequence of a divergence in development. One portion, in the quantitative sense, of an attitude or instinctual impulse has remained unaltered, while another portion has undergone further development. This brings us to the more general problem of preservation in the sphere of the mind. The subject has hardly been studied as yet, but it is so attractive and important that we may be allowed to turn our attention to it for a little, even though our excuse is insufficient. Since we overcame the error of supposing that the forgetting we are familiar with signified a destruction of the memory trace, that is, its annihilation, we have been inclined to take the opposite view, that in mental life, nothing which has once been formed can perish, that everything is somehow preserved, and that in suitable circumstances, when, for instance, regression goes back far enough, it can once more be brought to light. Let us try to grasp what this assumption involves by taking an analogy from another field. We will choose as an example this history of the eternal city. Historians tell us that the oldest Rome was the Roma Quadrata, a fenced settlement on the Palatine. Then followed the phase of the Septimontium, a federation of the settlements on the different hills. After that came the city bounded by the Servian wall, and later still, after all the transformations during the period of the Republic and the early Caesars, the city which the Emperor Aurelian surrounded with his walls. We will not follow the changes which the city went through any further, but we will ask ourselves how much a visitor, whom we will suppose to be equipped with the most complete historical and topographical knowledge, may still find left of these early stages in the Rome of today. Except for a few gaps, he will see the wall of Aurelian almost unchanged. In some places, he will be able to find sections of the Servian wall where they have been excavated and brought to light. If he knows enough, more than present-day archaeology does, he may perhaps be able to trace out in the plan of the city the whole course of that wall and the outline of the Roma Quadrata. Of the buildings which once occupied this ancient area, he will find nothing, or only scanty remains, for they exist no longer. The best information about Rome in the Republican era would only enable him at the most to point out the sites where the temples and public buildings of that period stood. Their place is now taken by ruins, but not by ruins of themselves, but of later restorations made after fires or destruction. It is hardly necessary to remark that all these remains of ancient Rome are found dovetailed into the jumble of a great metropolis which has grown up in the last few centuries since the Renaissance. There is certainly not a little that is ancient still buried in the soil of the city or beneath its modern buildings. This is the manner in which the past is preserved in historical sites like Rome. Now, let us, by a flight of imagination, suppose that Rome is not a human habitation, but a psychical entity with a similarly long and copious past, an entity, that is to say, in which nothing has once come into existence will have passed away, and all the earlier phases of development continue to exist alongside the latest one. This would mean that in Rome, the palaces of the Caesars and the Septizonium of Septimius Severus would still be rising to their old height on the Palatine, and that the castle of St. Angelo would still be carrying on its battlements, the beautiful statues which graced it until the siege by the Goths, and so on. But more than this, in the place occupied by the Palazzo Caffarelli would once more stand, without the palazzo having to be removed, the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, and this not only in its latest shape, as the Romans of the empire saw it, but also in its earliest one, when it still showed Etruscan forms and was ornamented with terracotta antefixes. Where the Colosseum now stands, we could at the same time admire Nero's vanished golden house. On the piazza of the Pantheon, we should find not only the Pantheon of today, as it was bequeathed to us by Hadrian, but on the same site, the original edifice erected by Agrippa. Indeed, the same piece of ground would be supporting the church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva and the ancient temple over which it was built. And the observer would perhaps only have to change the direction of his glance or his position in order to call up the one view or the other. There is clearly no point in spinning our fantasy any further, for it leads to things that are unimaginable and even absurd. If we want to represent historical sequence in spatial terms, we can only do it by juxtaposition in space. The same space cannot have two different contents. Our attempt seems to be an idle game. It has only one justification. It shows us how far we are from mastering the characteristics of mental life by representing them in pictorial terms. There is one further objection which has to be considered. The question may be raised why we choose precisely the past of a city to compare with the past of the mind. The assumption that everything past is preserved holds good even in mental life only on condition that the organ of the mind has remained intact and that its tissues have not been damaged by trauma or inflammation. But destructive influences which can be compared to causes of illness like these are never lacking in the history of a city. Even if it has had a less checkered past than Rome, and even if, like London, it has hardly ever suffered from the visitations of the enemy. Demolitions and replacement of buildings occur in the course of the most peaceful development of a city. A city is thus a priori unsuited for a comparison of this sort with the mental organism. We bow to this objection, and abandoning our attempt to draw a striking contrast, we will turn instead to what is, after all, a more closely related object of comparison, the body of an animal or a human being. But here too we find the same thing. The earlier phases of development are in no sense still preserved. They have been absorbed into the later phases for which they have supplied the material. The embryo cannot be discovered in the adult. The thymus gland of childhood is replaced after puberty by connective tissue, but is no longer present itself. In the marrow bones of the grown man, I can, it is true, trace the outline of the child's bone, but it itself has disappeared, having lengthened and thickened until it has attained its definitive form. The fact remains that only in the mind is such a preservation of all the earlier stages alongside of the final form possible, and that we are not in a position to represent this phenomenon in pictorial terms. Perhaps we are going too far in this. Perhaps we ought to content ourselves with asserting that what is past in mental life may be preserved and is not necessarily destroyed. It is always possible that even in the mind, some of what is old is effaced or absorbed, whether in the normal course of things or as an exception, to such an extent that it cannot be restored or revivified by any means, or that preservation in general is dependent on certain favorable conditions. It is possible, but we know nothing about it. We can only hold fast to the fact that it is rather the rule than the exception for the past to be preserved in mental life. Thus, we are perfectly willing to acknowledge that the oceanic feeling exists in many people, and we are inclined to trace it back to an early phase of ego feeling. The further question then arises: what claim this feeling has to be regarded as the source of religious needs? To me, the claim does not seem compelling. After all, a feeling can only be a source of energy if it is itself the expression of a strong need. the derivation of religious needs from the infant's helplessness and the longing for the father aroused by it seems to me incontrovertible, especially since the feeling is not simply prolonged from childhood days, but is permanently sustained by fear of the superior power of fate. I cannot think of any need in childhood as strong as the need for a father's protection. Thus, the part played by the oceanic feeling, which might seek something like the restoration of limitless narcissism, is ousted from a place in the foreground. The origin of the religious attitude can be traced back in clear outlines as far as the feeling of infantile helplessness. There may be something further behind that, but for the present, it is wrapped in obscurity. I can imagine that the oceanic feeling became connected with religion later on. The oneness with the universe, which constitutes its ideational content, sounds like a first attempt at a religion consolation, as though it were another way of disclaiming the danger which the ego recognizes as threatening it from the external world. Let me admit once more that it is very difficult for me to work with these almost intangible quantities. Another friend of mine, whose insatiable craving for knowledge has led him to make the most unusual experiments and has ended by giving him encyclopedic knowledge, has assured me that through the practices of yoga, by withdrawing from the world, by fixing the attention on bodily functions, and by peculiar methods of breathing, one can in fact evoke new sensations and synesthesias in oneself, which he regards as regressions to primordial states of mind which have long ago been overlaid. He sees in them a physiological basis, as it were, of much of the wisdom of mysticism. It would not be hard to find connections here with a number of obscure modifications of mental life, such as trances and ecstasies. But I am moved to exclaim, in the words of Schiller's diver, "Let him rejoice who breathes up here in the roseate light." Okay, I'm just going to take 1 second to ask Linda Clarke if everything is going okay technically.
We've lost Linda.
Okay.
Yeah, it's okay for the moment.
Excellent.
We've a number of people who weren't able to join, but we're sorry. This is our first time, and we'll have it all hopefully fixed up for next week. So
okay,
it's very popular.
Just to mention to people that the function of the chat, you've to give us a little bit of time because it goes very fast with so many participants. I see Daniel from the UK saying working 100% well.
Good.
And you pronounced Unglück very well. Yes, Natalie Wolfing from Berlin. Thank you. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to our guest, Roger Litten, who is a member of the London Society of the NLS, a member of the World Association of Psychoanalysis, and who is going to be doing the commentary of this first section today.
Thank you, Florencia. Thank you all. Most of all for the invitation to be part of this vital endeavor in these present times. It's a pleasure to be here in some kind of contact with all of you, being able to work together despite the restrictions that we are all experiencing each in our own way. Florencia just asked me to make some comments around the chapter that we've read. I'll say immediately that I haven't followed the instructions. I'm going to just make 3 brief comments on this fine first chapter, and then say some things more as an introduction, shall we say, to the reading of this text as a whole, taking advantage of my position as the introduction to the text, linking it up to the question, why are we reading this text now? And there I will hope to link up to Florencia's brief comments right at the introduction of her reading about the question of psychoanalysis as a talking cure versus a writing cure. It strikes me because that's exactly where I was hoping to put some of my comments or questions. And of the nature of psychoanalysis as a talking cure versus its nature as a possible writing cure. It also brings into focus the question of the nature of reading as opposed to what's involved in the activity of listening, given that the bulk of you find yourself in the position of listening. This is why what I'd like to encourage you all to do is to make use, given the technological limitations, let's say, of digital interactivity, to make use of the chat function just as a running commentary. If you are, let's say, subjected to listening to whatever I might have to say, please take the chance to be writing your own comments and thoughts as we go, as part of a live streaming, because it would be really interesting at the end of each event or the series of it to be able to just track through that list of comments that you come up, even if it's to disagree with some of the comments that might have been, or suggest alternative thoughts. I'm giving you some of the thoughts that were provoked in me by this reading, and I hope that we will hear some of the thoughts that might be provoked in you as we go along. So my 3 points on this first chapter itself, to some extent framed around, as always, the useful introductions of the Standard Edition and Strachey, pointing out that this first chapter was published separately in advance of the bulk of the text, Civilization and Its Discontents. So to some extent, we could pose the question of the slightly separate status of this first chapter in relation to the subsequent argument that we'll trace through the different chapters. To one extent, we see that this chapter is more clearly a response or linked to Freud's previous work from 1927, The Future of an Illusion. It responds to comments provoked by that first text. Most of all, around this notion of the oceanic feeling. Now, in the framework, shall we say, of what we've been taught by Lacan and Miller, it's very difficult to ignore this reference to the oceanic feeling as answering, shall we say, to some of the coordinates of the logic of feminine jouissance, something boundless and without limits. What is striking is to see Freud exploring the source of the religious sentiment and encountering this question of the oceanic feeling, which he says quite clearly that he has no experience of. And it's interesting to see him revert to his insistence of the reference to the Father. He says he can't see that there would be any other derivation for the religious sentiment than the child's longing for the protection of the father. At exactly the point that we see this reference to the oceanic feeling opening up, shall we say, a reference to the register of feminine jouissance, the boundless and the limitless. That's on the question of the source of the religious sentiment. He will then, I must say, I would concentrate on the first half of this chapter, where the argument is much more dense, where the second half of the chapter, starting with the account of Rome, is a little bit more scenic, but there are very well-worked questions in the first few pages. Going from the source of the religious sentiment around this oceanic feeling to what is effectively the source of the sentiment of reality. Yes, it's a question of a genetic account of the ego, but to some extent, the question of the ego in relation to what would be the source of the sentiment of reality, contrasted with the sentiment of religion. It makes quite a nice articulation. He will then trace an account of this sentiment of reality in terms of, let's say, three main parameters. One, the relation between ego and objects. Two, the relation between inside and outside. And tangled in there, we can see a reference to the relation between the pleasure principle and the reality principle. In each instance, turning on this question of the role of a specific action that you know that Lacan picks up and I think traces all the way back to the project, some 35 years before, the role of a specific action in introducing that distinction between ego, object, inside, outside, pleasure principle, reality principle, to some extent supporting the possibility of a sentiment of reality. And what I like about the link between the sentiment of religion and the sentiment of reality is the strong notion that reality is a sentiment. What would the sentiment of reality be, and what would be the conditions of that sentiment? The third point in relation to that is going to be the sentiment of life, because once Freud has sketched a possible genetic account of the conditions of the reality, or the conditions of the ego and a relation to reality, in parallel, he will open up the question of the possibility of disturbances in that genetic account under which a relation to reality will become possible, which effectively opens up, shall we say, some vital indications for a clinic of psychosis in relation to the failure of the sentiment of reality and the disruption of the relation between ego and objects. So when we're speaking about possible disturbances in the sentiment of reality, the relation to reality, how can we ignore Lacan's reference to a disturbance at the inmost juncture of the subject's sentiment of life as the key reference for a disruption at the heart of any clinic of psychosis, and ultimately any stabilized clinic of neurosis, is that disruption where the knotting that supports the subject's sentiment of life is disrupted and unknotted. So in these few pages, we have the source of the religious sentiment, the source of the sentiment of reality, and sketched out possible disturbances in the subject's sentiment of living. It seems to me that there's some questions we could usefully explore. Also, let's say, following that logic, the dynamic between the logic of the all and the not all in terms of how it might be pursued through the subsequent chapters. I leave some of those questions for your own reading, but I did want to take the chance to introduce this fine project around the question of reading. Why are we reading this particular text, and why now? And I was hoping to link that question to something of the question of the present moment that brings us together under these circumstances, virtual or not. I think we entitled to characterize the present moment as a moment of rupture, an effect, shall we say, of disruption and discontinuity between the past that was so familiar a couple of weeks ago and a future that is a little bit uncertain at the moment. So undoubtedly, we find ourselves in a moment of disorientation. It's at that point that we take recourse, shall we say, to this text, Civilization and Its Discontent. Is this simply, let's say, a question of nostalgia, a way to keep ourselves busy in this moment of isolation, to lean on some of the reassurances of the dream of past certainties at a point where the present and the future is so uncertain? Certainly the recourse to the text to our activity of working has certain effects of stabilization and reassurance. But beyond that, certainly, while we're trying to find our way to take our bearings under these new conditions, we can pose seriously the question of our orientation, how we situate ourselves in confronting these questions, how we make use of our clinical orientation, shall we say, as the basis for a reading of the current circumstances and the position that we adopt in relation to it as a response. In relation to that question of orientation and disorientation, we come to the question of reading, looking for some kind of oriented reading of this particular text at this particular moment. You're all quite aware of the role played by reading in our own orientation, not just in the formative effects, but as Florencia highlighted, in our clinical practice itself, as the orientation of our practice. In relation to that question of an oriented clinical reading, we can pose the question, shall we say, of the conditions of legibility of reading per se. In this moment where the world has become a little illegible under the disruptions of the current moment, we can look to the role of the master signifier as the prime condition of legibility, subjective legibility, legibility of the text, but not overlook, shall we say, the reference to the object A, to jouissance, to what we might call the living letter of the text as another point of reference for an oriented reading. We know that Lacan's own return to Freud was in the first instance as an exercise of reading Freud to the letter, making room fairly rapidly precisely for that distinction between the signifier and the letter, which in turn will lead Lacan to a rearticulation of the relation between reading and writing, putting to some extent the primacy of writing to the fore. Ultimately, the question of what goes on not writing itself, that which does not cease to not write itself, in relation, let's say, to a mode of writing that is not to be read, which brings us closer to the question of what would an orientation on the real be. At this point, if you will allow me, we can pose the question of the status of this virus that has affected us all one way or another, and its status in relation to the real. I hope you will have seen on LRO in recent days the very fine text by Michael Besols questioning how we understand the real of this virus. He made a very fine point, which is not something I was aware of before, that a virus is not something alive. It is not living. Rather, it requires something alive, a cell, a bacterium, in order to propagate and transmit itself. This I find quite striking, because effectively here we have something that takes the form of effectively of a written program, which relies on a parasitical relation to life, to the living, in order to propagate and transmit itself. At the expense, shall we say, as each one of us is only too aware, at the expense of sickness and death for the living creature that is its vehicle. Do we not have here something that would at least approximate, shall we say, a form of writing of the death drive? Death in the midst of life, posing the question of our response, how we respond to this new situation. in the first instance as a subjective response, inevitably symptomatic. As Michael Bassols points out, we certainly have a heightened awareness of the hypochondriacal potential of our relation to our body, a sensitivity of what could be a possible prodromal symptom, but also in terms of the response at the level of society, the inevitable effects of panic and contagion that we've seen across the globe. To the extent that now the response, the recommended response by the medical authorities as well as the governmental authorities is social distancing and self-isolation, which comes, shall we say, along with the heightened awareness of the risk posed to us by the others around us, most of all those closest to us. Suddenly, once again, in the face of an invisible enemy, it is our neighbor who poses the greatest threat to our health and security. You know that as we get further into this text, we will encounter this question of the status that I give to the love of my neighbor. So, subjective response, social response, response at the level of society, as well as consequences at the level of government, political responses. You've seen the rapid centralization of command, the reversion to the attraction of authoritarian rule, the emergency evacuation of all public spaces. Each one of us banished to their own solitary cell, where suddenly we find ourselves precipitated into the digital panopticon. Bentham could not have foreseen that the digital materialization of the logic of the panopticon. So at every level, we see social and political effects of convolution on a global scale, where our world is suddenly turned into some kind of global petri dish for this virus, an experimental laboratory for the political and social responses to a single unique agent diffused through every country in the globe. It's an unprecedented situation. If nothing else, putting into question what we understand by civilization on a global scale. Therefore, the choice of our return to this particular text could hardly be more timely. The question of civilization and its discontents, a text whose very title takes on a new meaning for each one of us under the current conditions. You also know that a fundamental aspect of a psychoanalytic reading, a Lacanian reading, is the question of bringing a text to life, to reanimating the text in the light of present questions, of present concerns. Now, it just occurs to me at that point that this notion of reading as an animation of the text, of bringing the text back to life, is to some degree the very converse operation of what we've just said about the operation of the virus itself. A writing that brings death. We're looking for a form of reading that can bring the text, the writing, back to life. I'm not quite sure how we configure those questions, but it's quite clear that what we would be looking for here is not just a resorting to our familiar references, but to some extent a reaffirmation of the social bond, the working bond of our orientation, but also looking for a mode of reading that goes against the grain of the death drive and affirms our desire for life. All of this at stake, shall we say, in the familiar operation of working a text, of seeking to bring it to life or to bring it up to date, which we could say is perhaps the key text for the key test for the reading of any text, ancient or modern, whether it still has something to say to us today, whether it's still a living text. In this instance, under the current circumstances, we would want to know whether this particular text of Freud, not just whether it still has something to say to us today, but whether it might provide us with some of the resources, the vocabulary, the tools for an enhanced reading of our present circumstances. specifically at this point of unprecedented illegibility, or at least to help us formulate better some of the questions with which we find ourselves confronted and which we find ourselves called on to respond to. Thus, I don't think it's simply a question of reading the text to give us something to do in the meantime. At stake, we could say, is not just the question of the conditions of legibility of reading, or the question of an orientation, but at stake, I would say, is the very viability of our orientation itself. How to keep psychoanalysis valid, active, and up to date, able to respond to how it is able to speak to the present and respond to the circumstances. One question, we speak so easily, shall we say, as a response to the real, as a response of the real, an eruption of the real. One question would be, well, to what degree are we entitled to give this current event the value of an eruption of the real? Do we speak loosely of the real, or would we like to be as precise as possible in terms of how we orient ourselves in relation to the real?
Yes, Roger, we speak very loosely of the real,
yes,
as we speak very loosely of many concepts.
Yeah. But certainly one index, shall we say, would be of the real, would be this effect of eruption. Certainly marked, because what has happened to us all, to some degree or another, is certainly marked a rupture between past and present, past and future, has certainly had the effect of reading the world a little bit more unfamiliar in its heightened familiarity, rendering things a little bit more illegible, and certainly has had the effect of posing a challenge to all the customary discourses on which we rely and scattering some of our most cherished master signifiers to the winds. It's here that we can address the question of our return to Freud under these conditions. To some extent, as we were just saying before we commenced, this is it's a Talmudic operation, a biblical activity, gathering ourselves together around the text. In itself has certain effects of social bonding, of reassurance, a return to a primary reference to the scriptures, both as oracle for our questions and also as the hope of our salvation, written into the notion of faithfulness to the letter of the text. How is faithfulness to the letter of the text to be distinguished from worship of the name of the Father? Here we might take our guidance from Lacan's own return to Freud, which entails, at least, shall we say, a dual operation. On the one hand, that very notion of faithfulness to the letter, reading to the letter, with all the religious overtones that you might wish, reaffirming, shall we say, the legitimacy of Freud's Magister Dixit before all the other false gods of ego psychology and neo-Freudian psychoanalysis. But at the same time, we can make out a second operation of reading accompanying the first, which entails, shall we say, turning Freud inside out, bringing Freud up to date, precisely by challenging the value of the Magister Dixit, of purifying psychoanalysis of its reliance on the myths of the Father. There's a question here in those terms of the articulation, shall we say, between the name of the Father and the Magister Dixit that gives authority to the text. We could argue, perhaps, that the introduction of the notion of the master signifier in Lacan, which to some extent comes to replace his reference to the name of the Father, emerges out of Lacan's effort to purify psychoanalysis from reliance on the reference to the Magister Dixit of the Father. Anyhow, we can locate two aspects, two operations in Lacan's return to Freud, which could also perhaps be aligned with the early Lacan and the late Lacan. On the one hand, faithfulness to the letter of Freud, reaffirmation of the letter of Freud, and on the other hand, challenging of the authority of the father and our reliance on the reference to the name of the father as the legibility of the text, our reliance on the master signifier to give legibility to the text. These two operations are perhaps seen most clearly at work in the very title of the seminar that marks the passage, the threshold to the later Lacan, Seminar 17, whose French title, as you know, is open to so many translations, but all of which entail to some degree the notion of turning psychoanalysis inside out.
Mm.
Thus, if we sought to read Freud with Lacan, this text of Freud with Lacan's aid, with the resources of Lacan, it's clear that the essential reference, the essential complement would be Seminar 17, with its title, Psychoanalysis Inside Out. Precisely for the critique where we find Lacan's most stringent critique of the myths of the father, at the same time as his formulation of the famous 4 discourses, which effectively we're talking about the discourses of civilization, his reduction of civilization to the status of discourse, which at the very point where we see the formulation of the analytic discourse in counterposition to the discourse of the master, we also see the point of intersection between the clinic and civilization. Where the boundary between the reading of the clinic and the reading of civilization, to some extent, is dissolved and is crossed. At this point of intersection, the discursive framework of the clinic and of civilization also helps us to locate the common reference where the two cross over, which would be the point of articulation between symbolic and real, central to the question of the clinical orientation, and to some extent central to how we understand what is at stake in the discourse of civilization. If you'll allow me. When I referred earlier to a point of rupture, in some way entailing an eruption of the real onto the stage of civilization, we can see it comes with the consequent effect of the disruption of the framework of discourse, the framework of civilization, the discursive framework of civilization. Also, to some extent, bringing into view the converse question, which is of the very possibility of purchase of the symbolic on the real. So at the point we find the real erupting to disrupt the discursive framework of civilization, it brings into view, well, under what conditions does the symbolic have grasp on the real in the first place, in the clinic or in the project of civilization? Whether we understand that as the point of overlap between symbolic and real, or the point of purchase between the signifier and jouissance. But the moment we're able to conceive of the notion of civilization, this sociological concept of civilization, within the framework of discourses, straight away we're able to locate the question of bodies captured by discourse as the project of civilization, in the way that it's formulated by the title of one of the last chapters in Seminar 19, I think, Bodies Captured by Discourse. That is the project of civilization, as well, shall we say, as the role of discourse in the allocation of places, the distribution of jouissance and the allocation of subjective places around a central point of impossibility. Which we could say is the place marked by the impossibility of the sexual non-rapport. All of that, shall we say, as a rapid sketch of a possible reading of this text of Freud with Lacan, Civilization and Its Discontents, in the light of the theory of discourses as posed by Seminar 17. Which would also, at the same time, bring into view a role for a third essential reference for our work across the reading of this text, with, on the one hand, Freud with Lacan, but also, as you know, Lacan with Miller. And maybe here we see a place for Miller's text from 2004, Commentaries, his text, A Fantasy, where Miller effectively explores the reconfiguration of the discourse of civilization, effectively the discourse of the master, but under the conditions of hypermodernity, under the new conditions of civilization, where the discourses themselves are turned inside out or upside down, and the contemporary discourse of the master is realigned in alignment with the discourse of the analyst. Posing, if nothing else, the question of the articulation between those two discourses, discourse of the master, discourse of the analyst, and the challenges for the contemporary analytic clinic to reinvent itself under those new conditions, to respond to the new configuration of the discourse of civilization, and for the implications for the way that the relation between the symbolic and the real is played out. I'm going to pause there. I've got a few more things that I could say about this text itself. I'm aware that I've attempted to do a rapid sketch, which is in danger of both being too long and too hurried, and therefore perhaps of limited value, except in prodding, shall we say, opening some spaces for considering how we might pursue this text. I might pause there and see whether we can make room for some other voices and some other points of reference as we approach this reading over the weeks to come.
Thank you, Roger. Well, I have to say the function of reader goes along with the function of how shall we call it, moderator. We are having, of course, Roger, you weren't reading the screen, but we have had already a myriad of conversations initiated. Excellent. And very interesting remarks, some responding to each other. I am aware that I'm aware that I touch my face a lot, and it's not, you're not supposed
never
to
before.
do that, but you see, this is what the camera allows you to recognize as well. I'm aware that the different sections of this text by Freud have various lengths. So in terms of the reading and the time allocating for commenting and for questions, we are going to be adjusting that every week. And fortunately, there was quite a miscalculation on our part in terms of the time that we would have available for the commentators and for the questions and answers. What would be, I'm going to call Linda to unmute herself and tell us if we are going to be able to avail of this dialogue that's opened in the chat room. Can we keep it for after the seminar, Linda?
The notes?
Yeah, well, all the comments from all the attendees.
Yeah, I think so. I think we should be able to. Yeah.
Okay.
But please keep commenting as fast as you can write.
I go with the last comment, and then we work our way up, and then if people feel, you know, very strongly about an urgent point, please let us know. Yeah, raise your hand. There's a function for that, or write. And Linda also is reading the comments. And will help us moderate it. But I have the last point here with the discussion is around what you mentioned, Roger, one of the many points that are very important for us at this time. What real is at stake when we speak of the eruption of the real? One of our guest commentators, Gustavo de Sal from Madrid, says we should distinguish the virus as a scientific real and the pandemic as an encounter with the real that concerns the subject, and therefore psychoanalysis. There are some other points. Natalie Wolfing, yes, as Michael Bassols made very clear in his recent text that was quoted by Roger. Marina Veneca agrees with this and adds something to this in terms of each subject has his or her own real, so each case by case. Roger, do you want to maybe elaborate a little bit on this? Because it's true that this text by Freud, one could say that there is a sense that the whole topological problems that Freud has been trying to work through from the time of the project for a scientific psychology, you can sense it here. Yeah. So I think it's, I thank you, Roger, for giving us the reference of Seminar 17, the other side of psychoanalysis, because, or psychoanalysis inside out, because I think it's a very good way of noting our questions about the subject in analysis, our questions about psychoanalysis itself as a discourse, and our questions about eventually what contribution can psychoanalysis make at the level of the political.
Absolutely, and again, as always, we have to be, let's say, cautious not to get too tangled up into the slippage into some kind of sociology, given to some extent the pressure of events around us. So at the same time, nor is it a question of the application, shall we say, of our orientation simply to a reading of current events, because to some extent, I think it's more useful to be thinking about the converse slope. How does the current situation question our orientation? It's a questioning, let's say, of the adequacy of our orientation to provide a reading and a platform for responding to the questions posed by this question. And each time, I think that's why this question of how we grasp the interface between the cultural and the clinic, we want to be looking for the reverse slope of how do we refine our clinical orientation on the basis of the reorganization of some of the discursive frameworks within which we operate in our clinic. And that's not simply just because at the moment, if we want to stay in contact with our analysans, it has to be via a digital platform. I'm quite prepared to hear other voices at this stage, if that's possible.
Yes, who wants to participate? We have Gustav Mondal. How can the past and present or every stages of history can be jumbled up side by side in the unconscious? What kind of space does it inhabit, if not the city of Roma Quadrata, nor our body? So it's a question straight taken from the reading of the text. Maybe Gustav wants to advance his own orientation. It's very difficult to know if...
Do we have the availability for panelists to raise their voice, or can they only submit written?
No, I can
written
unmute. I can unmute.
Yes,
certain people, if you want me to do that.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yes, let's hear some other voices while we can.
Okay. Okay, I'll have to go through the list. Hold on.
Oh, you have to do it one by one?
Well, I could allow everybody to talk, I think.
Yes, we can do that.
That would be an interesting pandemic experiment.
Of course. If
a
anyone,
bit of pandemonium.
Yeah, but if anyone out there is more familiar with this and how to use it and how to better how to better make use of the instrument, don't let us know, because we're happy to figure it out and discover it
as we go along.
Well, Veronique can speak now. I don't know.
I can speak.
Yes, you can. We can hear you now if you want to.
Can I be seen? Can I be seen?
Can you
so
be
far,
seen?
you
No,
cannot be seen, but you can be heard.
Seen.
No, you can't, because there's too many participants.
Yeah, only your voice for the moment.
No, I mean, for me, I was just thinking, as I was saying in the discussion, in the chat discussion, that it strikes me that the concept that Lacan always returns to in Freud's work is the Verneinung concept. And for me, it's a very mysterious concept. And, when you were talking about the constitution of the outside and the inside and the ego and the object and the pleasure and the reality and so on, it's these oppositions which Lacan does away with. Because for Lacan, there is no reality but psychical reality. So it's artificial to even begin to distinguish between outside and inside and so on. And yet the concept of the Verneinung is something that always recurs in Lacan's work, even in Seminar 24 at the end, as something which is very useful in order to apportion being and ce qu'il y a, what's of the one and what is of the register of being. So, beyond the current context of the pandemic and so on, I was just thinking that it could be a good moment to be precise about what is going on in Lacan's picking and using Freud. But that's just an idea that I had, because in terms of course, reading the first section of Civilization and Its Discontents, we really see that the Entwurf is Freud's myth. It's a biological myth, but according to Freud, everything answers to biology. And then there is the idea that whatever happens is inscribed biologically, and nothing can be erased, and everything can be explained, and it's a real biological explanation of what a human being is, and the oceanic feeling is explained in these terms. So because a child's helplessness is answered by a resort to the father, therefore there is religion. Okay, so that's Freud's answer, but it's a biological myth. So to go to Raphael's point about the Weltanschauung, and Raphael's quotes,
Veronique, can I ask you to recap a little bit, because depending on how people have their own settings established, some participants will have seen the exchange between Raphael and yourself about the notion of Weltanschauung.
I'm going to read what, so Raphael was asking right at the beginning, does Freud have a Weltanschauung? And then I answered by saying that at the beginning of the text, Freud says, we need a psychoanalytic explanation, i.e. a genetic explanation. So it's very interesting that Freud equates the psychoanalytic with the genetic. Okay, the word psychoanalysis is a way to deal with the genetic. It's a very interesting premise of Freud. That's why I'm saying that the Entwurf is Freud's myth. It's the foundational myth, that everything is written in our biology. And psychoanalysis is an answer to the phylogenetic. They're not distinguishable from one another. And then Raphael came back with this very interesting quote: "Psychoanalysis, in my opinion, is incapable of creating a Weltanschauung of its own. It does not need one. It is a part of science and can adhere to the scientific Weltanschauung." It's a quote from Freud. So Freud is saying psychoanalysis is scientific, and that therefore it doesn't have its own Weltanschauung. But for Freud, science is biology. Okay, and when Roger divided the text between these three binaries, object, ego, inside, outside, and reality, pleasure, those are binaries that account for a human being's reality according to biology. But Lacan accounts for human reality topologically, not biologically.
Just one brief point, Vera, about Freud's reliance on biological inscription. Isn't part of the irony that the function of the father is the one thing that is not biologically inscribed? It's a question of belief.
Not really, because it's a response to the helplessness. And the helplessness is a biological experience.
The Hilflosigkeit. Yes, excellent.
Thomas Svolos and Gustavo can now speak as well. I've unmuted them.
Yes, let's do it like this. Someone said that if you press the space bar, you can unmute yourself, but I'm not sure if that's the way it works. I'm going to ask everyone to write in the chat. Make sure that the option is that the message goes to all panelists and attendees. And if you want to be unmuted and speak, please let us know by this chat channel. Maybe Gustavo wants to intervene there with what he was writing right now, or Thomas Svolos.
Well, hello to everyone. Was just thank you, Florencia, and thank you, Roger, for this initiative. Really very interesting. I think of course, I agree with Veronique and evoking Lacan, but I think that Freud is not completely wrong. And we are, I think that we observe this phenomena of the claim for the return of the father. Now that we are living in this whole mess, social media reveals that most people everywhere are waiting for a strong master to come back and well, mend this disruption, this mess this shit we are all in. So what I mean is that when we are at the brink of a total helplessness, the idea of the father as a salvation comes up.
In fact, Joanne Conway in Ireland was making a remark about how we verify with many patients at the moment that suddenly they find religion as something that was not there before, and this happens.
Could we just an aside on the relation to religion, and shall we say the religion of the father? Let's also, one thing that's become clear in response to the current pandemic, I think Michael Basoltz again highlighted it, is the need for meaning. So if we speak about the real as something opaque to meaning, jouissance opaque for being resistant to meaning, of course there's an enhanced call for meaning as a point of orientation, whether to the father or not. But what I've been struck by is the proliferation of conspiracy theories, because any explanation is better than no explanation.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, it turns out conspiracy theories, to some extent, the father is a conspiracy theory. Again, going back to the madrem certum est, and the father is a hypothesis, is a deduction. It's a matter of belief by definition. But so now the conspiracy theory it gives meaning because there would be an explanation, and even if it doesn't give us an operational grasp on the situation, it's still better than being exposed to the randomness of the real.
This is Tom Svolos. Can you?
Hello, Thomas.
Hello, Tom.
Yes.
Okay. I want to say something on this point, which I think is interesting. I suspect, one thing I suspect is that this plays out very differently from country to country. In the United States, what was interesting, and this is an allusion to Gustavo's comment, is that early in the crisis, when Trump, who is a strong man, who has appealed to certain people in the United States, obviously he was elected president, Trump took the position that, hey, this is no big deal, we're on top of it, and this was very appealing for a certain number of people. But very quickly, the person who in the United States came to be most trusted in general on the coronavirus questions is a physician in one of the governmental bureaucracies, the National Institute of Health, named Anthony Fauci. And the thing that's interesting about Fauci, when people hear Fauci talk, is he says things like, well, we don't know this, based on other pandemics, we think this, but this is a supposition. His speech acknowledges in his speech all the lack of meaning, as Roger alluded to, everything we don't know about the virus and how we're making guesses or something like that. And he is widely admired, I think, on both sides of the political spectrum in this country, for precisely that he, in his discourse on what's going on and what we should do, he doesn't speak like a strong man, or in this kind of from a position of authority or for a position of conspiracy. And Trump, his own his talk about the virus. While there has been a tiny bit of, I would say, right-wing Republican conspiratorial comments, on the fringes, say, for example, in Congress about this whole thing, it's being driven out. It's interesting. People are able to see it for what it is and are pushing it out. I mean, it exists on social media, but it's not part of the discourse, that the sort of more mainstream discourse on the virus, at least in this country. And I understand this probably plays out radically different in different countries.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for adding to the discussion. Roger, you're following some of the comments. I really would like that the participants would speak what they are writing, because it's very interesting. Gustav, Linda, if you could.
Gustav, okay.
Gustav Mondal.
He's live now.
Go ahead.
Gustav.
Yeah.
So far, we don't hear you.
Well, he's unmuted. I think he's trying to join, but it's
but it's not coming through the sound.
Yeah.
Anybody else? The real has entered, says Phil Dabrowski. Yes, indeed.
Natalie Wolfing, I don't know if you're there, but she's live now. You see who else?
We're going to.
I would like. Can I ask if Roger or even Gustavo de Sal would want to comment a little bit more on the point Gustavo made maybe 20 minutes ago on the difference between a scientific real? I think the comment was the virus is a scientific real and the pandemic is an encounter with the real that concerns the subject and psychoanalysis. I'd be interested to hear people say a little bit more about that distinction, because the real is thrown around quite a bit here.
I would be happy to hear more from Gustavo on that question. As well.
Well, I'll try to improvise something about that, but I think that I agree with Michaela Sols in this point that virus is not a real without law, because for science, of course, the pandemic has a law. Mm-hmm. Even if some aspects of those laws aren't still discovered, but they assume that the virus and the development of the pandemic has a law, and they are trying to search it, to understand it. What is a different real for us is let's say, the impact of the pandemic on the subject. That's, for me, is the way to understand what is the bad encounter with the real that has no law, and thus the importance and the interest of religion, the claim for the Father, nostalgia for a complete other that will come to give us an explanation, will give us the way to save ourselves. So I think that in this point, it's very interesting to, at the same time, going back to the text, Freud's text that was the invitation to and for this meeting, the importance to understand that on one side there is a structural discomfort or discontent, and another sort of discontent that stems from the bad encounter with the real.
Maybe there, Gustavo, we could go back to what I think was one of Florencia's very initial comments about Freud's initial thoughts for the title around this idea of Unglück.
Unglück, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Unglück rather than the Unbehagen. And I think there's room for elaboration around that notion, both on the side of luck, fortune, and the bad encounter, as well as on the side of the question of happiness. We see there's a split of two problematics going on there, but on the side of luck and misfortune. That's the tuche, the taichi, the teacher, the distinction between teacher and automaton.
Automaton. Mm-hmm.
As Lacan elaborates that, because we could, it also gives us the articulation, shall we say, between the contingency of the encounter and the notion of destiny, of a necessary destiny, which is something played out in the religious sphere as well. It's not just I'm getting a bit of feedback from somewhere, but I'm not quite sure where it's coming. It's not just the necessary, the salvation of the Father in some material sense, as applying some kind of determinism, cause and effect explanation for the passage of events, because it seems to me that somewhere there between Tai Chi and automaton, we have an articulation between contingency and necessity, but we still need to see how that articulates around the question of impossibility. And maybe there we could reaffirm the logic of the real, not on the side of contingency nor necessity, but in terms of the question of impossibility, whether that's the most reliable reference at this stage or the only one.
That's right, Roger. I agree with you. Yeah.
Well, it's usually a good idea.
I think here we have something. Here we have something that was evoked in terms of how to. I'm going to ask Linda to mute maybe the
source of feedback,
the source of disruption. But there was when you started your commentary, Roger, that I want to thank you very much for. It gives us a frame to include many elements about why we decided to organize this seminar. What I mean by this is that, in fact, we don't know, and we won't know why we decided to organize this seminar in advance. We won't know it in advance. Yeah, one of the things that you said as part of this frame is this going back with this nostalgia to the thing that we can get hold of, or that we can feel secure with. Let's take Freud's
the nostalgia for the Father.
Let's take, you know, the all the volumes of the complete works of Sigmund Freud and read. You put it in terms of what are the conditions of legibility for us as psychoanalysts, and I think that's a very important question, as well, because of what Thomas Svolos introduced. We have to be very careful when we speak with our generalizations, yeah, because the conditions of legibility don't only depend on the concepts that we manage. They are rooted in concrete realities, if you would allow me that term. You put the question, Roger, is it the nostalgia because we can go back to the known past in the face of this opening of the uncertain future? Of course, the main thing for us, if we have one tool, is a certain way to know that future was always uncertain, and it's an opportunity to have a glimpse at, for each of us, what was it that kept the belief, the Duperry of the certain certainties for us.
And Florencia, does that not pose the converse question for us, as our discussion has shown, is what would be an orientation on the real?
We're going to finish on that. I thank you very much, Roger. I thank you, Linda, as well, and everybody who was there this morning. We look forward to continuing. We look forward to becoming this strange space juxtaposition, non-pictorial, virtual thing.
Artificial supplementary device.
Thank you, everyone. And see you next week. Next Saturday, we will continue. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Florence. Thank you, everyone.